My theology book defines this, Doctrines of Man, and in generic sense. And there are two chapters in particular that I want us to focus on. One is the essential nature of man, and then the other one has to do with what happens after this life on earth, so death and the intermediate state, which we've made some reference to already. Let's begin by looking at what's meant by the term human nature. Now, some of you have read those chapters, and I'll just rely on you to especially have comments that relate to what we're talking about today. And others of you, I'm sure, have had other opportunities to look at this doctrine in some way. Systematic theology, some would say it's a bit more speculative. I don't think that's really necessarily a fair thing to say. It takes biblical data about particular topics or doctrines and looks at what the scriptures are saying as a whole and looking at it in a way that makes sense out of that particular doctrine. And so it raises our understanding of different teachings in the Bible by making it more clear and organized. And so when it comes to the essential nature of the human, what is meant by human nature? It seems like maybe kind of a too simple a definition, but it's that essential nature or the essential components of being human. In other words, for our purposes, the composition of humans as a whole, but having two parts. He talks about different views of the essence. He talks about trichotomy, dichotomy, and monism. For those of you who've heard these things before, what do those refer to?
As I recall, the trichotomy is the soul and the spirit are separate,
Mm-hmm.
and then the body.
Mm-hmm.
And the dichotomy is two, whereas you have the soul and spirit being the same
Mm-hmm.
thing, just interchangeably mentioned in the Bible and the body or the material.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so restating what you have been saying here, that trichotomy, the people who have held to a trichotomist view of human nature have made a distinction between spirit and soul, and then also including body. There are some passages that refer to that distinction, but generally it's not and historically has not been as favored an understanding of the essence of humans. It is not viewed as being as consistent with what seems to be the interchangeable use of the words soul and spirit. In other words, the same things that are attributed to the idea of soul are attributed to spirit. But I wanted to mention, and he does, that there are alternate perspectives, which is a good maybe time for me to bring this point up, and that is that we all make commitments to what we believe. And the Bible is very clear, like I said, very intensive in its explanation of salvation. And I think it's possible to make very definite commitments to some very core doctrines about salvation and who Jesus is. And then there are doctrines that become a bit more peripheral or not as essential to salvation. But we all are theologians to some degree, in that we all bring together our beliefs about different topics in the Bible. And we can appeal to individuals who have a similar kind of respect for scriptures to help us have more clarity about those doctrines. In this case, again, I've referenced you all to Grudem's text, or his book on systematic theology, because it's very readable. It's also in German. And it's in both English and German, if you prefer one over the other. And so, when we are looking at this, we have to, I think, admit that there's not total agreement, but there are dominant positions. And the more dominant position is that soul and spirit are actually interchangeable terms. There are some problems with getting into defining soul as not being the same thing as spirit. And I think for our developing of a model of trying to help people, we have to make certain commitments along the way. And you'll have to, as well as those I've made. I'm trying to have a cohesive, a model of helping and understanding humans that holds together well and is comprehensible. I mean, that we can actually look at it and comprehend, oh, I see what that's trying to say. It makes sense. And so to be cohesive and comprehensible and to have some continuity. In other words, a model that explains things, and holds together on a lot of different kinds of topics. Now, this is, I'm saying that to you all because you all are in the training position that I wouldn't have said as much about when I was actually just teaching you all at life coaching, life mentoring trainings. But we have a model of helping. We have a system that has commitments, theologically and biblically. And so you have to be deciding where you are on those. And in this particular case, soul and spirit being two terms that, because the Bible doesn't say, okay, the letter to Christians on the composition of humans. There's no New Testament letter that lays things out that clearly. We're going to try to understand it as best we can and as systematically and thoroughly as we can. And it helps to see what historically has been confirmed by others to be the more understood or dominant position. So how are you all? And then there's monism. Okay, so we have the trichotomous view in which spirit, soul, and body are three different things. The dichotomous view, which is the view that I'm committed to, that says we have a material and immaterial part of us. And the immaterial part, the words spirit and soul can be used interchangeably. Then there is the monistic, or there's monism. Monism would be what we would find with people who have run that magnet over the scriptures that's extracted the spiritual or supernatural. But we find it also generally in the secular world, and in psychology in particular, there is no soul to the definition of human nature. There's self, and self is very often a composition of a lot of different facts, memories, learning, behavior, that connect with behaviors. And there is also an additive process we'll talk about in our one of our later sections about self-concept and other self-hyphen aspects to the person. But in secular psychology, there is no soul. There's no spirit part of a person. It all has to be explained by brain functioning. And neuroscience has done a pretty good job of solving the easy problem, they would say, philosophically. Because what we're talking about now not only is about theology, psychology, but it's also about philosophy. Since ancient philosophers, there's been active debates, and a lot of ink has been spent on the whole problem called the mind-body problem, or the problem of personal identity. And so what we're talking about here is we're making commitments where commitments have not been made by philosophy, although we have some philosophers who do address that immaterial part. But in the secular psychology field, there's a strong commitment to monism and explaining everything by brain activity. But it's the easy problem that can be more clearly solved, and that is you find out what part of the brain is active when a particular thing is happening. And with the more functional MRIs now that look at processes in the brain, you can look at activities in different parts of the brain. That's the easy problem. It's a correlational problem. Correlating what areas of the brain are active when certain things are happening. But it does not explain what activates the activation. That's the hard problem. It's the problem of consciousness that philosophers struggle with, that if someone says we've mapped out the brain's functioning and we have explained everything, no, they've explained the easy problem. And they haven't explained the hard one. That's why you have someone like Elon Musk buying a company called Neuralink, and it's a company that's attempting to interface the human brain with computers. And there are reasons for doing that, that I think could be beneficial. But you see what's happening there? It's not solving the hard problem. It's using a human brain to link with a computer. Then there's benefit in the two working together for certain probably health things and hopefully not more destructive reasons. But how are you all hearing this? What are you thinking as I'm talking about these three approaches? Thoughts? Comments?
It seems like it gets very complicated when you mix this and divide the soul and the spirit and the body together, and I just tend to go with Grudem too, with that soul spirit is interchangeable. It's the same term. It makes it more easier for me to understand how the person as the soul activates the brain and the body, or is master over that as a regenerated person.
Yeah, so you find it fits better for your thinking.
It makes it easier for me to understand and also to work with people in that sense.
Yeah. Others?
I agree with Will on that. It's easier not to have a distinction between soul and spirit, but I have a hard time saying there's dividing the physical into the physical body. Well, I would, a body and a brain. So body, brain, soul seems to me something I can work with easier. So the soul, we have thought processes, what goes on in our brain, and then we have a physical body.
Yeah, maybe if I'm hearing you right, that's one of the reasons why, and even I will do this, I'll say the soul, spirit, immaterial versus brain and body. And because obviously the brain is unique of the physical parts of the person. And let's keep that thought in mind as we go through this and other material that, and by the way, I think you mentioned the heart earlier. The heart has a mini brain in it. And actually sends signals to, the heart actually sends signals to the brain, which is something that's been more understood in more recent times, I think. But that is an important, I think, distinction, but there's not a real difference between brain and the rest of the body. It's all physical. But there are some unique or distinct things that the brain does apart from the rest, most of the rest of the body. Does that fit with what you're saying? That there's something unique about the brain?
Well, if you think of thought processes, it would be hard to measure and quantify them, which is why I find it hard to put the brain into the body, the physical part.
Because there are, actually like one of the philosophers, Adler, had talked about it in his book that's referenced in the training and practice resources. He doesn't even get into biblical material. He just simply says, look at intellect. How do we explain intellect physically? And so that's where it kind of connects with the idea of mind.
Yeah.
and thoughts. Yeah, so this is where, like in psychology, practically people will work with one, like a therapist with a client, as if there is someone in there who can do something, but then deny that there is anything immaterial. Do you know what I'm saying? It's a tricky position because the brain also automatically does certain things, regulates heart rate and things like that. And so there is some kind of functioning of the brain autonomously almost. But how do we draw the line between what the soul is doing and how we explain something like a thought? And then so is that kind of touching on?
Yeah, it does. But it's kind of like saying, well, thought belongs to the body too. I'm like, oh, okay. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's almost like to downsize the brain to
Mhm.
make it part of the same value as the body.
Mm-hmm. Is it saying that you don't like that?
No, I don't.
Yeah, because it's unique, isn't it? Well, so one kind of illustration that's been popular has been to think of the brain as like a television receiving a signal, and then displaying it on, when you view. It's taking some kind of signal and translating it into some other things. Well, we don't know how the soul actually interacts, which is spiritual, interacts with the physical body. That's been one of the arguments against this kind of dichotomous or dualist kind of view of there being material and immaterial. How do you explain the immaterial interacting with material? Well, for people who believe in the scriptures and believe God is a spirit, we don't have any problem with that because he created the physical, right? Interacts with the physical all the time. But it is a problem. It's a real problem. And we don't really have an explanation for how that works. Which the people on the side of only the physical don't have an explanation either. I mean, what's good for the goose, what the sauce that's good for the goose is also good for the gander is a kind of a phrase. In other words, the knife cuts both ways. If we can't explain, how in the very technical terms, the spirit moves the brain to think. They can't explain some things either about how it is, how they can't explain how it's activated either. So there's no advantage on either side, but we, of course, have a different truth source. But, thoughts?
Well, just hearing this conversation, I was thinking about how I've been sort of picturing this whole sort of process, and I think of it as, I don't know what it's called, but my kids have this bath toy that's a pipe, and it has a suction cup on the back, and you stick it to the bath, and when it's brand new, you pour water into it, and the water goes in the pipe, and it triggers a wheel that pushes it, continues to push it through, and then that comes out like a filter that then dumps it into the bath. So when it's brand new, that water is clean the whole way through. So I imagine that being like the spirit interacting with the body, like in its first created state. But then over time, my kids play with it, they leave it out. It gets water stuck in it, and then over time, this kind of like gross black mold forms on the inside of it, which makes the water function differently. So the water is still going in its purest form, but then the wheel, which I guess could, in this weird metaphor that I'm using, the wheel could be the brain, but it has a little bit of that black gunk in it, which affects how it comes out of the body, which affects how it comes out of the filter of the pipe. So then the water, though it started clean, comes out sometimes with black flecks in it. And depending on how badly my kids left it in the bath and it formed, the water may have more or less black gunk in it. And so I just have been picturing that lately as how a perfect spirit interacts with an imperfect brain and body, and that, it comes out sometimes we have tools to manage the brain so that there's less black flecks that come out in our lives, but then there's other seasons where it's much more difficult and maybe our lives are like very black flecky. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, no, I can't follow it. It's another illustration, which is helpful to have. Yeah, so it's similar to the reducing valve example or illustration that has been used, where you have water coming in at a certain pressure, like into a house, and it's too much pressure for the pipes of the house to handle. But they don't want to restrict the flow of the water. They just want to restrict the pressure of it. It's this kind of weird device called a reducing valve that will not restrict the flow of the water, but it'll tone down the pressure. And so when I had a house, our house in the last house in the U.S., when our neighbor got his water pressure tested, and it was about 90 psi, and they thought, I need a reducing valve. And then he talked with me, and I thought, whoa, I'm going to blow the pipes out of my house. It keeps up like that. I thought, can't we just turn down the flow of water? But no, then there wouldn't be as much water coming out of the faucet inside. So this reducing valve is a very curious thing. As much water comes out as before, with a good pressure, but it reduces it so it doesn't have a dangerous pressure. And so the idea is the Spirit has much more potential than our brains and bodies are able to handle. And they serve as a bit of a reducing valve. And, sometimes that reducing valve is gunked up, and sometimes it's cleaner, of the brain functioning and the body functioning. But what will our spirits be like free from our limited bodies? There's probably more potential than we can even imagine. And in a new resurrected body, there'll be congruence with that potential. And I'm not sure what that'll be like, but I'm thinking it's going to be pretty amazing. So we've been touching on these things here that are, again, in an organized way. Systematic theology looks at this topic. And what's also been being talked about here is that thing we touched on before, that souls, what happens to the soul at death, we'll be looking at it even further in a few minutes. But he mentioned some passages, which is what systematic theology would do, is go through passages and look at indications like of Rachel in the Old Testament. Her soul was departed before she died. And Isaiah in the Old Testament predicts that the servant of the Lord would pour out his soul to death. Sometimes it's viewed as biblically the soul returning to God, or the spirit returning to God. So David in Psalms says, into your hand I commit my spirit. Or at death the spirit returns to God who gave it, Ecclesiastes in the Old Testament. Or even Jesus, when he died, said he bowed his head and gave up his spirit. And likewise, in the book of Acts in the New Testament, Stephen, as he was dying, prayed, Lord Jesus, receive my spirit. And so here we have, it's touching on the idea of what happens after death, but it's the same sense of the spirit leaving and going to be somewhere else. The other thing I wanted to mention about an argument for soul is our own personal experience. And Grudem talks about that in his section on the essential nature of man, is that what does it feel like to be human? Doesn't it seem to fit that we have a person that we refer to as I inside of us?
Even languages, almost every language has personal pronouns, right? I, you, and talking about the person.
Mm-hmm.
So that soul animating the body is so connected, and we can't hardly really separate it. At the same time, We always talk about I, me, we're,
Mhm.
yeah.
And sometimes we'll say, well, I was talking to myself the other day.
Right.
Having
How
a
do-
conversation with you.
Yeah. And we will just not even realize what we're saying. But we are saying something very definite, aren't we?
Yes.
Our personal experience very much fits with this idea that we have someone, and sometimes this philosophers refer to this as a ghost in the machine. Viewing the body as a machine, and then there being something immaterial. We do have that personal, first-hand experience that I exist, and I do something like talk to myself, or I decide to do something, or I make a choice, or sometimes I feel like I couldn't help myself. You know, that kind of dilemma also, right? Also, we have an inner awareness of the presence of God at times. This comes out with worship, with music, in prayer. They've done research with Carmelite, I believe it is, nuns. And they're sort of more meditative prayer, and they did brain analysis of what's going on with Carmelite nuns during their more meditative prayer. And there's this kind of different brain functioning that's going on there. Sometimes we feel spiritually troubled or spiritually depressed. And some people even have a sense of spiritual negative oppression upon them. So there is this perception. It can be even somewhat distinct from our rational thought processes. In fact, Paul, the Apostle Paul, may have been referring to this when he said his spirit prays, but his mind does not understand.
In Psalms 104, we could see David talking to his soul
Mm-hmm.
and making his soul to praise the Lord.
Mm-hmm.
Probably in his understanding, he was going through, well, you could see it below, he was going probably through depression or trials,
Mhm.
circumstances. So
Something.
he's having that conversation with
Yeah,
him.
yeah. And there again, it's a first-hand kind of experience that we have as well.
Mhm.
And we resonate with the Apostle Paul in a similar way, but slightly different topic. In Romans 7, when he says, I do the things I don't want to do. Right? There's sort of a duality in there, isn't there? Of the mind desiring one thing, and this again, how do we say, what we say mind is, how do we define mind, how do we define heart? You know, we're touching on all those, and you do use the word pronoun. All those are touching upon this more immaterial person. And even my thinking, I use my brain to think.
Decide to
Yeah. And so how much of what gets attributed to brain functioning is actually our soul animating the brain to do that? But we are so, in this era, at this time of history, we are so indoctrinated with a scientific view that we have to actually, maybe even shockingly, be surprised at times how much we have bought into the brain causing things.
Causing what things?
Oh, anything. Except some more automatic things that the brain can do. So I use this illustration of Tony Stark and his exoskeleton. Okay, so it's a popular movie, Iron Man, and Tony Stark, which I think illustrates to some extent, every illustration has its limits, what happens with the brain and the soul activating the brain and the body. Because Tony Stark is this amazing inventor, you know, and has this company that develops all kinds of, unfortunately, weapons of mass destruction. But he develops this suit that allows him to fly around and do all kinds of things. See, when he gets suited up in this exoskeleton, which actually exists, there are some militaries in different countries who already have exoskeletons that they're beginning to use in a limited way, I think. But he gets suited up, and Tony is inside this suit, that has a computer. Jarvis, I think, is the name of the computer. And Tony can interact with the computer, Jarvis, to have conversations with each other, you know. And the actual exoskeleton can do different functions. And so we think about Tony being the soul, and we think about the computer and the exoskeleton being our brains, and then the actual exoskeleton, or this suit, being the rest of the body. We can get some kind of maybe simplistic idea about how there has to be an interaction between the soul and the brain for the brain to do something. Beyond just basic kind of functions like I was saying, heart rate and breathing, skin temperature, things like that, that it requires the brain to activate that part it requires the soul to activate that part of the brain. If we look at it just from a physical perspective, we look at the brain lighting up in certain areas when certain things are happening. We see systems in the brain interacting with each other. We come with explanations of when this happens, these things are happening neurochemically and in terms of the brain function. But what we can't see is what I believe the case, and that is that the soul activates the brain to do those things. But also the brain has learning patterns, and those can become almost automatic. We find ourselves having knee-jerk responses. In other words, automatic negative responses. This is a gunking up you talked about of that simple thing in the bathtub. The brain gets gunked up with a lot of bad learning, and gets entrenched or it gets overlearned, and without our intervention directly of our person or soul, we can actually be caught up in behaviors that are contrary to what we really want to do. And we might, in some extreme cases, feel pretty trapped by it. The other thing I wanted to mention before we have to end is this whole idea of what happens to people when they die. We've touched on it with the verses we read earlier. Grudem develops it even more in his systematic theology. And that is, of course, the intermediate state. In other words, when people die, they don't immediately have a new body, a resurrected body. Although you'll find some theologians believe in immediate resurrection. You'll find some theologians believe in the extinction view, where people actually cease to exist until God resurrects later. You'll find some people who say the people who are not Christians, instead of going to hell, are exterminated and no longer exist. So you'll find a diversity of views. You'll find some people who are wanting to be acceptable within the scientific community, even though they're Christians, who will give explanations that don't cause them to have to make such strong commitments to the supernatural. And so they'll have like an emergent view that the brain actually develops an immaterial person, and then they don't have exactly a good explanation of what happens when the person dies, and they might have to say, well, okay, there's an immediate resurrection. Because as we were talking about earlier, the Bible does seem to indicate a continuity from this life of the person to the next. And so Grudem is developing a stronger case where there is a state of disembodied soul that happens immediately at death that is consistent with the Scriptures. And so that means that both people who are Christians and who are not in relationship with God will experience conscious awareness after death, but it'll be outside of or without a physical body. That's called the intermediate state. I think it helps us in our commitments to the idea of the soul being a person, which we'll get into in our next section, to realize that there is that continuity, immediately being in the presence of God upon our deaths, but in a disembodied state, temporarily until the final resurrection. And so, anyway, that gets us to our next break. time goes pretty rapidly. Do you have a comment, Holly? We have 2 minutes.
Sorry, I was just wondering if in this conversation or in the next coming conversations, if we were going to talk about like the appearance of Moses
Or Samuel?
or Samuel, yeah, talking.
When the witch of Endor conjured up his spirit.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, that's an Old Testament passage. Briefly, I don't want to get too deeply into the specific things like that, but you'll find in the Old Testament the story of, I believe it was Saul, when he was king, and he knew that he wasn't supposed to do this. He went to someone who would conjure up or had this divination that they would do, the souls of the dead. In the story in the Old Testament, it's not promoting that as something to do. In fact, there may be some indications that the witch of Endor, who did this conjuring, might have been really surprised that an actual spirit came up. But we have there in that Old Testament passage what appears to be a soul, the soul of, I think it was Samuel, actually coming back and interacting with them on that occasion. So, is that what you're referring to? Is there another
Are you
one?
talking about transfiguration, are you?
Maybe that, or it's like one of the visions, like where I looked and I saw,
Moses and Elijah?
maybe that, yes,
Mhm.
that.
That's the transfiguration.
Like a person type.
Yeah, that's another interesting one, isn't it? Jesus' transfiguration, where there appeared with him Moses and Elijah, and Peter says, "Should I build some temples and worship you all?" You know,
Yeah.
and Peter was always wanting to get in there and do something. But there's an example of there being something that was recognizable of people who were no longer physically alive. Then there's in Revelation the souls under the praising God, and they're underneath the altar. Yes. Those are some.
That's what it is.
All right, great. So there are some other ones. I just encourage you, we just touched on it now, but I want you to be aware that there are systematic theological explanations for these kinds of things. They've been very well developed, and they're available for you to read further, and if you are looking at wanting to make stronger commitments to your beliefs about certain things, that could be helpful. Let's take another break, and we'll come back in 10 minutes.